Most people think growing old means your body becomes weaker. In my case, it sharpened something far more valuable than strength. It sharpened my instincts. After spending more than 4 decades investigating financial fraud and reading people who believed they were smarter than everyone else, I learned one lesson that never failed me. The smallest changes often reveal the biggest lies. My name is Arthur Bennett. I'm 73 years old, a widower, and according to my son Ryan, I worry too much. According to my daughter-in-law Vanessa Cole, I forget things that never happened. They both believed age had finally caught up with me. The truth was far simpler. I had started noticing things they hoped I never would. It began with tiny details that most people would dismiss without a second thought. A picture frame on the hallway table leaned slightly to the left instead of the right. The living room curtains were tied back with a different knot than the one I had used for years. My medicine cabinet was perfectly organized every morning, yet every few days one bottle would be facing the opposite direction. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken, but someone had been inside my apartment while I was away. At first, I convinced myself grief was playing tricks on me. My wife Helen had passed away less than a year earlier after a long battle with cancer. We had shared this apartment for nearly 45 years, and every corner still carried a memory of her. Sometimes I could almost hear her humming softly while watering the plants near the kitchen window. Losing someone you love changes the way you see the world. It makes you question your own mind. So I tried to ignore the feeling. Then the visits became impossible to explain. Vanessa had developed a new routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, she would stop by to check on me. She always carried the same warm smile, asked whether I had eaten lunch, and insisted she was only making sure I wasn't feeling lonely. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect daughter-in-law. She brought homemade soup, folded laundry I hadn't asked her to touch, and reminded me to take my medication. Ryan couldn't stop telling people how lucky I was to have someone who cared so much. I wanted to believe him. God knows I wanted to believe him. But every visit left my apartment feeling different. Vanessa never stayed where guests usually stayed. While I made coffee, she somehow found herself wandering into my bedroom. If I answered the phone, she disappeared into my home office. Once, I walked back from the kitchen and caught her standing in front of Helen's dresser. She smiled before I could say a word. "I was just looking for a blanket," she said casually. The explanation sounded reasonable. The feeling in my stomach did not. A week later, I invited Ryan over for dinner. I carefully explained everything I had noticed. I wasn't accusing anyone. I simply wanted another opinion. Ryan laughed gently, the way people do when they're trying not to hurt someone's feelings. "Dad," he said, "you've been through a lot this year. Vanessa is only trying to help. Maybe you're paying too much attention to little things because the apartment feels different without Mom." I looked into my son's eyes and saw genuine concern. He wasn't lying to me. He truly believed what he was saying. That hurt even more. Because if Ryan couldn't see what was happening, then someone had become very good at hiding it. That night, after they left, I sat alone in Helen's favorite chair, staring at the notebook she used to keep grocery lists. Instead of writing down milk or bread, I wrote a date. Then another. Then another. Every time Vanessa visited, I recorded the exact time she arrived, the exact time she left, and every unusual detail I discovered afterward. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. My notebook slowly filled with entries. Patterns began to emerge. Her visits almost always happened when she believed I would be out walking or attending my weekly veterans breakfast. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. One quiet Sunday evening, curiosity finally overcame doubt. I unlocked the security log connected to my apartment's electronic entry system, expecting to prove myself wrong. Instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. Over the previous 3 months, Vanessa's access code had opened my front door 36 separate times. I had only invited her inside 11 of those visits. I read the number again, hoping I had misunderstood it. 36 entries. 25 of them happened while I wasn't home. I slowly closed my laptop and looked around the apartment Helen and I had built together. For the first time in my life, my own home no longer felt like the safest place I knew. It felt like a crime scene, waiting for someone to notice the evidence. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't dealing with an overprotective daughter-in-law anymore. I was dealing with someone who believed an old man would never be clever enough to count how many times she'd quietly crossed his front door. Once I knew the number was real, I stopped questioning my memory and started questioning her purpose. 36 entries in 90 days was not concern. It was surveillance. It was preparation. And preparation always has a destination. The next morning, I changed nothing about my routine. I made coffee at 7, opened the curtains at 7:15, and left for my usual walk at 8. To anyone watching, I was still the same predictable old man who moved through life by habit. What Vanessa didn't know was that I had installed 2 motion-activated cameras before leaving the apartment. One faced the front door from inside a bookshelf. The other watched the hallway leading to my bedroom. I had spent decades proving theft with documents, timestamps, and patterns. I wasn't going to confront her again with suspicion. This time, I wanted proof strong enough to survive every excuse she could invent. When I returned just before noon, nothing looked dramatically wrong. The front door was locked, the kitchen was clean, the curtains remained exactly where I had left them. For a moment, I wondered whether she had sensed the trap. Then I noticed the wooden box on the shelf beside Helen's photograph. The lid sat slightly crooked. My chest tightened before I even crossed the room. Helen had given me that box on our 20th anniversary. Inside was a silver pocket watch that had belonged to her father. It had stopped working years ago, but after Helen died, I kept it wound anyway. I liked hearing the faint resistance in the mechanism, as if some part of the past still refused to disappear completely. I lifted the lid. The box was empty. I stood there longer than I care to admit, staring at the velvet lining where the watch had rested every day for more than a decade. It was not valuable. Any pawn shop would have offered less than $50. Vanessa had not taken it because she needed money. She had taken it because she knew what it meant to me. She wanted me to search for it, panic, accuse someone, and sound irrational. She wanted Ryan to hear another story about his confused father misplacing things. I took out my phone and sent a simple message. "Return Helen's watch." Vanessa replied 3 minutes later. "What watch?" "Arthur, this is exactly what Ryan and I are worried about. You keep losing things and blaming people. Please sit down and breathe." I read the message twice. The cruelty wasn't in the denial. It was in the tenderness she wrapped around it. She had learned that the easiest way to make a sane man sound unstable was to speak to him as though he already was. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat at my desk and opened the encrypted camera application. The footage began at 9:18 that morning. Vanessa entered using the access code Ryan had supposedly given her only for emergencies. She wore dark clothes and moved quietly, but not cautiously. She moved like someone who had done this many times before. She walked directly to my office, opened the lower drawer, and removed a folder containing my monthly bank statements. She photographed every page. Then she took pictures of my social security card, my driver's license, my insurance documents, and the deed to the cemetery plot beside Helen's grave. She didn't steal the papers because she didn't need the originals. She only needed the information. After returning everything to its place, she walked toward the shelf, opened the wooden box, and lifted Helen's watch into the light. For several seconds she studied it. Then she smiled. It was not the smile of someone finding an expensive object. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly how much pain a worthless object could cause. She slipped the watch into her pocket and left. I replayed that moment until anger gave way to clarity. Vanessa wasn't simply searching for money. She was collecting the pieces of my identity while creating a record of supposed confusion. If she could convince Ryan, a doctor, or a court that I was no longer competent, those photographs could help her take control of my accounts, my medical decisions, and eventually my property. The missing watch would become one more example of my declining memory. The moved folders would become proof that I misplaced important documents. Her unauthorized visits would be rewritten as acts of care. It was a careful plan because it depended on one assumption, that no one would believe the old man over the helpful daughter-in-law. I copied the footage to 3 separate drives and uploaded it to 2 encrypted servers. Then I printed every entry from the access log and placed the pages beside my handwritten notebook. For the first time, the pattern was complete. 36 unauthorized entries, photographs of personal records, theft of a sentimental item, deliberate attempts to make me doubt myself. I should have felt relieved. Evidence had always brought me comfort. Numbers don't manipulate. Timestamps don't cry in court. Video doesn't forget. But as I looked at Vanessa's face frozen on the screen, I thought about Ryan. My son had defended her because he trusted his wife, and part of me still wanted to protect him from what the truth would do. I remember teaching him to ride a bicycle, holding the seat until he found his balance, then running behind him even after he no longer needed me. A father spends years learning when to let go. No one teaches him what to do when his child rides willingly toward disaster. That evening, Ryan called and asked whether I had found the watch. His question told me Vanessa had already spoken to him. I kept my voice calm. "Not yet," he sighed. "Dad, maybe you put it somewhere else. Vanessa says you've been more forgetful lately." I closed my eyes. "And what do you think?" There was a long silence. "I think we may need to talk about getting you more help." Those words hurt more than Vanessa's theft. She had not only entered my home, she had entered my son's mind and rearranged the truth there too. When the call ended, I opened the closet and removed the charcoal suit I had not worn since Helen's funeral. I brushed the dust from the shoulders and placed it carefully on the bed. Vanessa believed she was hunting a lonely widower with a small pension and a fading memory. She had no idea that before retirement, I had spent 42 years exposing executives who hid millions behind respectable smiles. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw grief, age, and exhaustion. But beneath all of it, the investigator was still there. The next morning, I would visit the one person who knew exactly what kind of evidence could turn a family dispute into a criminal case. And once I walked into Evelyn Carter's office, there would be no going back to the quiet life Vanessa thought she had already stolen from me. The following morning, I woke before sunrise for the first time in months. Not because I had slept well, but because I had finally stopped pretending everything would somehow fix itself. Helen used to tell me that truth has a strange habit of waiting patiently. It never rushes. It never argues. It simply waits for the moment when someone is finally ready to face it. As I buttoned the charcoal suit hanging untouched since her funeral, I found myself staring at my reflection longer than usual. The man looking back at me had more wrinkles, thinner hair, and eyes that carried a kind of exhaustion no amount of sleep could erase. Yet beneath all of that, I recognized someone I hadn't seen in years. The investigator was still alive. He had simply been buried beneath grief. I slipped Helen's wedding ring into my jacket pocket, exactly where I had carried it every day since she passed away. "Time to finish what we started," I whispered, before walking out the door. My destination wasn't a police station. It wasn't a bank. It was the downtown office of Evelyn Carter, one of the sharpest attorneys I had ever worked with during my years investigating corporate fraud. We'd spent nearly 20 years exposing executives who believed expensive suits and polished smiles could hide criminal intent. If anyone understood how manipulation worked, it was Evelyn. When I stepped into her office, she looked up from her desk, blinked twice, and smiled in genuine surprise. "Arthur Bennett," she said, standing to shake my hand. "I haven't seen you wear a suit since your retirement dinner." "Neither have I answered. I was hoping I'd never need it again. Her smile faded the moment she saw the folder in my hands. "Something tells me this isn't a social visit." "No," I replied quietly. "It's a family matter." For nearly 2 hours, Evelyn watched every minute of security footage without interrupting once. She studied the access logs, examined my handwritten journal, compared the timestamps, and occasionally asked small, precise questions. She never rushed. She never jumped to conclusions. When the final video ended, she removed her glasses and leaned back in her chair. "Arthur," she said carefully, "this stopped being a family disagreement a long time ago." I remained silent. Unauthorized entry. Theft. Collection of personal identity documents. A clear pattern of psychological manipulation designed to make you appear mentally incompetent. She tapped the folder gently. "If this evidence is authentic, and I believe it is, you may be looking at attempted financial exploitation of an elderly adult." Hearing the words spoken aloud made everything feel frighteningly real. Until that moment, some part of me still hoped there was another explanation. Maybe Vanessa had acted recklessly. Maybe Ryan truly knew nothing. Maybe this could still be solved over dinner and an honest conversation. Evelyn seemed to read every thought crossing my face. "You're hoping this ends with an apology." I nodded. "Do you think that's possible?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded her hands together. "Arthur, I've handled enough cases like this to know something important. People willing to cross ethical lines rarely stop because they're confronted. They stop because they fail." I looked down at Helen's ring resting in my palm. "Ryan isn't like that." Evelyn's expression softened. "No, I don't think he is." She paused before adding, But good people can be convinced to ignore terrible decisions when those decisions come from someone they love. That sentence stayed with me. Vanessa wasn't only manipulating me. She was slowly reshaping the reality my own son believed. Evelyn stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city. "Before we decide what comes next," she said, "there's one question I need to ask." She turned back toward me. "Why haven't you told them the truth?" I smiled sadly. "Because I wanted a son, not an heir." Evelyn nodded as though she had expected exactly that answer. Very few people knew the full story of my life before retirement. Ryan certainly didn't. When Helen and I were raising him, we made a promise to each other. Our son would never grow up believing money solved problems or defined success. So while Bennett Capital Group quietly expanded into one of the region's most respected commercial property firms, we continued living in the same apartment, driving practical cars, and celebrating birthdays with backyard barbecues instead of luxury vacations. Ryan believed I had worked as an ordinary financial investigator before retiring with a comfortable pension. He had never asked for more, and I had never volunteered it. I wanted him to build his own future without wondering what mine was worth. Evelyn smiled faintly. "So, your daughter-in-law thinks she's manipulating a lonely retired man." "Exactly. And she has no idea she has been breaking into a building owned by the man she's trying to deceive." "Not just the building," I corrected gently. "The entire block belongs to Bennett Capital Group." Evelyn let out a slow breath before laughing quietly. "Arthur, that changes everything." But I shook my head. "Not yet." She looked at me curiously. "If we expose everything today, Vanessa will deny it. Ryan will defend her. They'll call this a misunderstanding." I walked toward the window beside her. I've spent my entire career watching dishonest people escape because investigators acted too early. Right now, Vanessa believes she's winning. People who think they're winning become careless. Evelyn crossed her arms. "You're suggesting we wait." "I'm suggesting we let her reveal exactly how far she's willing to go." The room fell silent. Finally, Evelyn returned to her desk and opened a blank legal pad. "If we're doing this," she said, "we do it properly. No tricks that cross legal boundaries. No manufactured evidence. We document everything." "Agreed." She began outlining the framework of a lawful operation. Every camera would be professionally installed. Every access log preserved through chain of custody. Every conversation recorded only where legally permitted. The goal wasn't revenge. The goal was to allow Vanessa's own choices to create undeniable evidence. As she wrote, I noticed the old excitement returning to my mind, not excitement over catching someone, but the calm focus that always came before an investigation reached its turning point. When the meeting ended, Evelyn handed me a single sheet of paper. It contained one sentence. "Never interrupt someone who believes they've already outsmarted you." I folded the note into my pocket beside Helen's ring. As I walked toward the elevator, my phone vibrated. A message from Vanessa appeared on the screen. "Hi, Arthur. Ryan and I were thinking of stopping by tomorrow afternoon to make sure you're doing okay. Hope that's all right." I stared at the words for several seconds before smiling to myself. She believed she was choosing the time of our next meeting. In reality, she had just accepted an invitation she didn't even know had been waiting for her. Tomorrow, the first piece of our plan would quietly fall into place. The next 48 hours were strangely peaceful. I still followed my usual routine, watered the flowers on my balcony, walked to the neighborhood cafe every morning, and waved to the same people who had greeted Helen and me for years. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen nothing unusual. That was exactly what I wanted. The strongest trap is the one that never feels like a trap at all. Evelyn Carter handled the legal details, while I quietly prepared the stage. Every security camera was upgraded with high-definition recording and secure cloud backups. Every access point inside the apartment was professionally documented. Even the electronic lock was recalibrated, so every entry, every failed attempt, and every second the door remained open would be permanently recorded. There would be no arguments about faulty timestamps or missing footage. If Vanessa crossed another line, the evidence would speak for itself. But evidence alone wasn't enough. After 42 years investigating financial crimes, I knew something most people didn't. Greed rarely reveals itself when opportunity is uncertain. It reveals itself when success feels guaranteed. That was the weakness we intended to expose. My apartment occupied Unit 4B, a space that technically remained part of Bennett Capital Group's commercial property portfolio. Years earlier, Long before Ryan married Vanessa, I had quietly converted one section of the apartment into a legally registered corporate archive for historical business documents. It wasn't secret. It simply wasn't something anyone in my family had ever cared enough to ask about. Evelyn smiled when she reviewed the paperwork. If someone unlawfully enters that archive, she explained, this is no longer a disagreement between relatives. They're breaking into protected commercial property. I nodded. Let's hope it never comes to that. We both knew it probably would. The following afternoon, contractors arrived, carrying what appeared to be an oversized fireproof safe. Vanessa happened to arrive only 15 minutes later with a container of homemade soup balanced carefully in her hands. Her timing was almost perfect. She smiled warmly at the workers before looking at me. Arthur, she asked with innocent curiosity, what's going on? I laughed softly. Just some old company paperwork. Nothing exciting. She watched as the safe disappeared into the archive room. I noticed her eyes lingering on the heavy steel door, much longer than necessary. Curiosity had already become calculation. During lunch, I made another move. While Vanessa cleared the dishes from the kitchen table, I deliberately answered a phone call loud enough for her to hear every word. Yes, I said casually. $500,000 in cash isn't something I like keeping in the bank these days. Leave it exactly where we discussed. I'll move it next week. I paused as though listening. No one knows it's there. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. It was also completely fake. There was no cash, no hidden fortune, no secret transaction. The only thing I had placed inside the safe was a stack of outdated accounting ledgers and several blank folders wrapped in bank paper to resemble bundles of money on security cameras. The purpose wasn't to tempt an honest person. It was to reveal the intentions of someone already searching for an excuse. Vanessa pretended not to notice the conversation. She even laughed when I accidentally spilled a little coffee onto the table. But over the next hour, I caught her glancing toward the archive room at least 6 different times. Every look lasted only a second or two. Every look told me exactly what I needed to know. That evening, after she left, Evelyn reviewed the footage beside me. She heard every word, she said, and she looked at that door like it had already been opened. I remained silent. I wasn't happy. I wasn't proud. I was simply disappointed that the plan appeared to be working exactly as expected. The following morning, Ryan called unexpectedly. Dad, he began, sounding slightly uncomfortable. Vanessa mentioned you still keep important company records at home. Some old files, I replied. Why? He hesitated before speaking again. Nothing. She just thought, maybe that isn't very safe. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Those weren't Ryan's words. They belonged to someone planting ideas inside his mind, one careful conversation at a time. I've managed those records for decades, I answered calmly. I'm sure they'll survive another week. Ryan quickly changed the subject, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He wasn't trying to deceive me. He was trying to convince himself that everything was normal. That realization hurt more than I expected. Vanessa wasn't only chasing money anymore. She was slowly teaching my own son to question my judgment while trusting hers instead. 2 nights later, another notification appeared on my phone from the apartment's security system. Vanessa had entered again while I was attending my weekly veterans dinner. This time, she didn't wander aimlessly through the apartment. She walked directly to the archive room, examined the new safe from every angle, photographed the electronic keypad, measured the hinges with her phone, and quietly left less than 7 minutes later. She never attempted to open it. She was studying it, preparing for it. When I showed the footage to Evelyn the next morning, she didn't say anything for several seconds. Finally, she looked at me and quietly spoke the words I had been expecting since this investigation began. Arthur, she's no longer looking for information. I know. Evelyn folded her notebook shut. She's planning the break-in. At almost the exact same moment, another camera alert appeared on my phone. This one wasn't from my apartment. It showed Ryan and Vanessa sitting together inside their car, outside my building. Ryan looked anxious. Vanessa was speaking rapidly, pointing toward the upper floors while handing him a printed sheet of paper. He read it, shook his head once, then looked back toward the building. After nearly a minute of silence, he slowly nodded. I stared at the screen, my heart heavier than it had been at any point during the investigation. I wasn't watching my son commit a crime. I was watching the exact moment he agreed to take the first irreversible step toward one. I barely slept that night. Not because I feared what Vanessa might do, but because I feared what Ryan might become. Throughout my career, I had watched intelligent people destroy everything they loved. Not because they were evil, but because they convinced themselves that one dishonest decision would solve every problem. It never did. One lie demanded another. One crime created the need for the next. I prayed my son would still find the courage to walk away before reaching that point. The following afternoon, another alert appeared on my phone. Ryan had entered the building alone. That surprised me. According to the cameras, he walked slowly through the lobby, paused outside my apartment door, then raised his hand as if he intended to knock. Instead, he lowered it, stared at the floor for several long seconds, and quietly walked away without ever coming inside. I replayed the footage twice. Something inside him was still fighting back. He hadn't crossed the line yet. Later that evening, Vanessa arrived at their house. The camera installed near the parking area captured them sitting inside Ryan's car for nearly 40 minutes. There was no audio, but their body language said more than words ever could. Ryan repeatedly shook his head. Vanessa leaned closer each time, speaking with growing intensity. At one point, she placed both hands over his, as though offering comfort. A few minutes later, she pointed toward my building, then toward a folder resting between them. Ryan covered his face with one hand. When he finally looked up, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. My heart sank. I had seen that expression before. It was the face of someone surrendering not because they believed something was right, but because resisting had become too exhausting. The next morning, Evelyn arrived, carrying a stack of legal documents. She studied the latest footage before closing her laptop. "Ryan still has a conscience," she said quietly. "That's why Vanessa keeps pushing." "Can we stop this now?" I asked. Evelyn looked at me carefully. "Legally, yes. We have enough evidence to file a civil action today." She paused before continuing. "But if we do, Ryan will spend the rest of his life believing you overreacted, and Vanessa will claim she was misunderstood. Neither of them will truly face what they've become." I knew she was right. Sometimes exposing the truth required allowing people to finish making the choice they had already started. It was a painful lesson, but one I had learned many years earlier. We spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for what Evelyn called the final test. Every camera angle was checked again. Motion sensors were recalibrated. The electronic lock was synchronized with the building's central security system. Detective Marcus Hale reviewed the operation personally. "We don't move unless a crime is actually committed," he reminded everyone. "No assumptions, no shortcuts. They make every decision themselves." I appreciated those words. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't about humiliating my family. It was about making sure the truth could never be questioned. Before leaving, Marcus turned to me. "Arthur, once this begins, you'll probably see things no father should ever have to see." I answered quietly. "I've already seen the hardest part." He frowned slightly. "What was that?" I looked toward the window overlooking the city, watching my son slowly stop trusting the man who raised him. That evening, I deliberately followed my normal routine. I left the apartment carrying an overnight bag, nodded politely to the concierge, and told him I probably wouldn't return until the following afternoon. It was another small piece of theater, carefully designed to make the apartment appear completely unoccupied. Instead of checking into the hotel Vanessa believed I used every month, I rode the private elevator to the executive penthouse owned by Bennett Capital Group. Very few people even knew the penthouse existed. From there, I could monitor every security camera in the building without being seen. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of computer monitors displaying live video feeds. Evelyn sat beside me, reviewing legal paperwork, while Detective Marcus Hale coordinated with officers, waiting several blocks away. Nobody spoke much. There was nothing left to plan. We were simply waiting to discover whether Ryan would choose his father, or follow Vanessa one step too far. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The city outside grew silent. At 1:43 a.m., one of the monitors flashed with movement. A dark SUV rolled slowly into the underground garage. My pulse quickened as two familiar figures stepped out. Vanessa wore black gloves and carried a large duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Ryan followed several steps behind, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. He wasn't carrying burglary tools. He was carrying hesitation. They reached the service elevator without speaking. When the doors closed behind them, I noticed Ryan glance once toward the security camera mounted above the hallway. For a brief second, it almost felt as though he wanted someone to stop him before it was too late. Then the elevator began climbing toward the fourth floor. Detective Hale quietly picked up his radio but didn't press the transmit button. Evelyn folded her hands together and looked at me. Neither of us said a word. Every decision from this moment forward belonged to Ryan and Vanessa alone. The elevator indicator reached the fourth floor, and the doors slowly opened. The elevator doors opened with a soft mechanical chime that sounded almost ordinary. Watching from the security monitors, I found myself wishing, just for one impossible moment, that Ryan would step back inside, press the lobby button, and leave. Nothing had happened yet. No crime had been committed. There was still time for him to walk away. Instead, he followed Vanessa into the hallway. She moved with unsettling confidence, as though she had already rehearsed every step in her mind. Ryan stayed several feet behind, glancing over his shoulder more than once. Even from the camera feed, I could see he was nervous. Detective Marcus Hale folded his arms quietly beside me. "Your son doesn't look like a man who wants to be here," he observed. I kept my eyes on the screen. "No," I answered softly. "He looks like a man who no longer knows how to say no." Vanessa stopped outside the archive room and unzipped the duffel bag. Inside were a pry bar, heavy-duty bolt cutters, insulated gloves, a cordless drill, and a compact flashlight wrapped in black tape to reduce the glare. She handed Ryan the flashlight. He hesitated before taking it. His hands were already shaking. She spoke to him in a calm voice, pointing toward the hallway, and then toward the safe inside the room. Ryan quietly nodded, though every movement suggested he wished he were somewhere else. Marcus reached for his radio. Evelyn gently placed a hand on his arm. "Not yet," she whispered. "They haven't crossed the line." We continued watching in complete silence. Vanessa removed a small device from her pocket and held it against the electronic lock. She tried copying the signal from Ryan's access card. Nothing happened. Her smile disappeared. "She's improvising now," Evelyn murmured. Vanessa looked around the hallway before pulling the pry bar from the bag. Ryan immediately stepped closer, saying something we couldn't hear. His expression pleaded with her to stop. She answered sharply, then pushed the tool into his hands. For several long seconds, he didn't move. My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard the faint scrape of metal against the door through the security microphones. Ryan slowly lowered the pry bar. He shook his head. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief before snatching it back herself. With one violent pull, she forced the edge between the frame and the lock. The sound echoed through the empty hallway. Marcus looked toward me. "Arthur?" he asked quietly. I closed my eyes for a brief second before nodding. "Keep watching." The first strike wasn't enough, neither was the second. On the third attempt, the lock housing cracked. Vanessa smiled. Ryan didn't. He stood frozen, staring at the damaged door, as though he had just realized there was no way to undo what had happened. They stepped inside the archive room. The camera mounted above the shelves captured everything with perfect clarity. Vanessa walked directly to the fireproof safe while Ryan remained near the entrance. "He's acting as a lookout," Marcus said. "Reluctantly," Evelyn replied. Vanessa knelt beside the safe and examined the keypad. When the code failed, she reached for the cordless drill. The sharp sound of metal grinding against steel filled the room. Ryan flinched with every second that passed. After nearly 2 minutes, Vanessa slammed the drill onto the floor in frustration. She pointed toward the pry bar again. Ryan didn't move. She shouted something at him. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he stepped forward and helped wedge the bar beneath the safe's locking mechanism. Together they pulled. The reinforced handle bent just enough to trigger the internal pressure sensor hidden inside the frame. A silent alarm activated instantly. No flashing lights. No loud sirens. Nothing that warned them the building had already informed law enforcement. Marcus calmly pressed the transmit button on his radio. "Operation is live. All units move." The response came immediately. "Copy." 2 minutes out. Inside the archive room, Vanessa laughed with relief as the safe door finally swung open. She ripped away the folders wrapped to resemble stacks of cash. Her excitement vanished almost instantly. Instead of bundles of money, she found outdated accounting ledgers, blank paper, and one sealed envelope resting neatly on top. Across the front, in bold black letters, were 6 simple words. "Greed always arrives before consequences." Vanessa stared at the message in stunned silence. Ryan slowly picked up the envelope with trembling hands. Before he could open it, bright flashlights flooded the room from every direction. Police! Nobody move! Officers entered through both doors with practiced precision. Ryan instinctively raised his hands before anyone gave the command a second time. The pry bar slipped from his fingers and struck the floor with a heavy metallic crash that echoed through the room. Vanessa stood completely frozen, unable to speak. Detective Marcus Hale walked in last, his badge visible beneath his jacket. He calmly looked from the damaged door to the burglary tools scattered across the floor, then to the open safe. Everything has been recorded, he said evenly. Nobody needs to explain anything right now. Ryan lowered his head. His shoulders began to shake. Vanessa finally found her voice. This is ridiculous, she shouted. It's his apartment. We're family. Marcus looked at her without anger. Family doesn't authorize breaking into secured property in the middle of the night with burglary tools. As officers carefully secured the evidence, I stepped out of the private elevator and walked slowly into the hallway. Ryan looked up the moment he saw me, the color drained from his face. For several seconds, father and son simply stared at one another. He didn't look frightened anymore. He looked heartbroken. Dad, he whispered, barely able to form the word. I held his gaze but couldn't answer. There are moments in a father's life when silence carries more pain than any sentence ever could. For several long seconds, no one moved. The only sounds inside the archive room were the quiet clicks of cameras documenting evidence and the metallic snap of handcuffs being prepared. Ryan stood motionless, staring at me as though he were hoping this was all some terrible misunderstanding that could still be undone. Vanessa recovered much faster. Arthur, she said, forcing a nervous smile. Thank goodness you're here. You need to tell them this is all a mistake. Ryan has a key to your apartment. We were only trying to protect your company records after hearing you kept cash in the safe. Detective Marcus Hale didn't interrupt her. He simply nodded toward one of the officers, who continued photographing the damaged door, the pry bar, the drill, and every tool scattered across the floor. Then he calmly turned back to Vanessa. Interesting explanation, he said. Could you also explain why someone protecting property would force open a secured commercial archive at 2 o'clock in the morning? Vanessa's confident expression faltered for the first time. Because we thought Arthur might be in danger. Marcus raised an eyebrow. From his own locked door? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no answer that fit the evidence surrounding her. I slowly walked into the room, stopping only a few feet away from Ryan. He still couldn't look me in the eyes. Instead, he stared at the cracked concrete floor, as though every mistake he'd made was written across it. Dad, he whispered. I can explain. I took a slow breath before answering. Ryan, explanations come before someone picks up a crowbar. After that, all that's left are consequences. My words weren't angry. They were simply tired. That seemed to hurt him more than if I had shouted. Evelyn Carter stepped into the room carrying a thick folder. Detective Hale, she said, handing over several certified documents. These are the ownership records for the property. Marcus carefully reviewed the paperwork before looking directly at Vanessa. Mrs. Cole, he said evenly, you repeatedly referred to this as your father-in-law's apartment. He held up the documents. It isn't. Confusion spread across her face. Marcus continued. This entire building, including the commercial archive you unlawfully entered tonight, is owned by Bennett Capital Group. Vanessa frowned. So what? Evelyn answered before Marcus could. Arthur Bennett is the founder, majority owner, and chairman of Bennett Capital Group. The room fell completely silent. Ryan slowly lifted his head, his face drained of all color. What? He whispered. I looked at my son with quiet sadness. I never hid my success because I was ashamed of it, I said. I kept it private because your mother and I wanted you to build your own life without measuring people by what they owned. Ryan blinked repeatedly, struggling to process what he had just heard. You own the building? Not only this building, I answered gently. Your mother and I spent 40 years building Bennett Capital Group. We simply never wanted wealth to become the center of this family. Vanessa stared at me in disbelief. That's impossible. Evelyn calmly placed another document on the table. Corporate registration, property deeds, tax filings, board records. Every document has already been verified. Vanessa's breathing became noticeably faster. For months, she had believed she was manipulating a lonely widower, living off a modest retirement income. Now she was standing inside the headquarters archive of the very man she had spent months trying to deceive. Marcus quietly folded the documents closed. "There's something else you should understand." He pointed toward the reinforced door they had forced open. "This room isn't legally classified as residential property. It is a secured corporate records facility containing protected business documents." Vanessa stared at him without speaking. Marcus continued calmly. "That changes the legal nature of tonight's crimes considerably." The realization struck her all at once. This was no longer a family dispute, no longer an argument over inheritance or concern for an elderly relative. Every decision she had made tonight had placed her inside a criminal investigation involving commercial burglary, attempted theft, destruction of protected property, and financial exploitation of an elderly adult. For the first time since officers entered the room, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Ryan looked back at me, tears beginning to form. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" I smiled sadly. "Because I wanted you to love your father." I paused, my voice quieter now. "Not his bank account." Ryan covered his face with both hands. Every memory seemed to crash into him at once. Our small family vacations, the second-hand pickup truck I drove for nearly 20 years, the modest apartment where his mother baked birthday cakes instead of hiring caterers. He finally understood none of it had been because we couldn't afford more. It had been because Helen and I believed character mattered more than comfort. Vanessa suddenly reached for Ryan's arm. "Say something," she whispered urgently. "Tell them this isn't what it looks like." Ryan slowly pulled his arm away. For several seconds, he simply stared at the broken safe, the damaged door, and the burglary tools lying across the floor. Then he whispered the words Vanessa had never expected to hear. "No." His voice cracked. "It looks exactly like what we did." The silence that followed was heavier than any courtroom verdict. In that single sentence, my son finally stopped protecting the lie that had been destroying all of us. Ryan's words seemed to drain the last ounce of confidence from the room. "It looks exactly like what we did." No one spoke for several seconds. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief, as though she had just watched the ground disappear beneath her feet. She had expected him to defend her. Instead, he had finally chosen the truth. Detective Marcus Hale quietly instructed the officers to finish collecting the burglary tools, fingerprint every surface, and secure the damaged safe. No one rushed. There was no dramatic shouting or unnecessary force. The evidence was already overwhelming. Marcus believed in something he had told me the first day we met. When the facts are strong enough, the loudest voice in the room should be the evidence itself. Vanessa suddenly stepped toward me, tears filling her eyes almost instantly. "Arthur, please," she said, her voice trembling. "We made a mistake. We thought someone else might steal your money. Ryan was only trying to protect you." Marcus looked at her calmly. "Mrs. Cole, you've changed your explanation 4 times in less than 10 minutes. Evelyn Carter opened her folder and quietly laid several photographs across the conference table inside the archive room. "Let's not rely on memory," she said. "Let's rely on facts." The first photograph showed Vanessa entering my apartment weeks earlier while I was attending my veterans' breakfast. The second showed her photographing my financial records. The third captured her removing Helen's silver pocket watch from the wooden box. The fourth displayed her carefully examining the electronic lock on the archive room just days before the break-in. Finally, Evelyn played the security footage from that night. Every movement appeared in crystal clear detail. The pry bar, the drill, the damaged door, the forced entry, Ryan lowering his head as the safe finally opened. Vanessa watched silently until the screen went dark. "You planned this," Evelyn said softly. "Not in one night, not in one moment. For months." Vanessa immediately shook her head. "No, you're making it sound worse than it was." Evelyn didn't argue. Instead, she placed another document on the table. It was a printed copy of my apartment's electronic access log. 36 unauthorized entries in 90 days. Then another document. Photographs of Mr. Bennett's identification, banking information, insurance records, and personal financial documents. Then another. A complete timeline matching every unauthorized visit with the surveillance footage. She closed the folder gently. This wasn't curiosity. It wasn't concern. It was preparation. Ryan remained completely silent. He never once tried to interrupt. Marcus finally turned toward him. "Ryan," he said quietly, "is there anything you want to add before we continue?" My son took a long, shaky breath. I knew she was coming here. He paused. At first, I believed she only wanted to see whether Dad was managing his finances. He swallowed hard. Then it became checking documents. Then looking for trust papers. Then she started talking about how much easier everyone's life would be if someone else handled his affairs. His voice grew weaker with every sentence. Every time I questioned it, she said I was overreacting. He looked directly at me for the first time since the arrest. I should have stopped it months ago. I didn't answer. There wasn't a sentence in the world capable of repairing the damage between us in that moment. Marcus slowly nodded. People rarely wake up intending to commit a serious crime, he said. Most simply, keep accepting one bad decision after another until they no longer recognize themselves. Vanessa looked toward Ryan in complete disbelief. You're blaming me? Ryan closed his eyes. No. When he opened them again, there was a sadness I had never seen before. I'm finally blaming myself. Evelyn reached into her briefcase one last time. Arthur, she said, handing me a small velvet box. I believe this belongs to you. I opened it carefully. Inside lay Helen's silver pocket watch. The faint scratches near the cover were exactly where I remembered them. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. I gently wound the old mechanism exactly as Helen used to do every Sunday afternoon. After several quiet turns, the tiny watch began ticking once again. The sound was almost inaudible, yet somehow it filled the entire room. I looked at Ryan while holding the watch in my hand. Do you remember this? I asked softly. Tears rolled down his face immediately. Mom used to let me hold it when I was little. I nodded. She told you it wasn't valuable because of the silver. Ryan slowly whispered the words Helen had taught him decades earlier. It was valuable because it reminded us that time is something you never get back. Neither of us said another word. Even Marcus lowered his eyes. In that quiet moment, the missing watch became far more than evidence. It became a reminder of everything our family had lost, long before anyone forced open a door or touched a safe. As officers prepared to escort Vanessa and Ryan downstairs, Marcus approached me one final time. Arthur, he said quietly, the district attorney will ask whether you're willing to recommend leniency for your son based on his cooperation tonight. I looked at Ryan standing silently beside the officers, then down at Helen's watch resting in my palm. My answer would shape the rest of my son's life. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I truly didn't know what the right thing to do was. I didn't answer Detective Marcus Hale immediately. Some questions deserve more than the first emotion that comes to mind. I looked at Ryan standing only a few feet away, his wrists restrained, his shoulders slumped beneath a weight no handcuffs could ever match. Then I looked down at Helen's silver pocket watch resting quietly in my hand. It had survived decades of birthdays, anniversaries, illnesses, and heartbreak. Somehow, despite everything that had happened, it was still ticking. I wondered if families could do the same. Marcus waited patiently. Arthur, he repeated gently, the prosecutor will consider your recommendation. Whatever you decide won't erase the charges, but it may influence how the court views Ryan's willingness to accept responsibility. I closed the watch and slipped it carefully into my jacket pocket. I'll tell the truth, I said. Nothing more, nothing less. Marcus nodded. That may be the fairest answer anyone gives in this case. Over the following weeks, my apartment became strangely quiet again. The investigators came and went, collecting documents, reviewing financial records, and interviewing witnesses. Every room reminded me of Helen, the kitchen where she used to sing while baking bread, the balcony where we drank coffee every Sunday morning. Even the hallway carried echoes of Ryan racing through the apartment as a little boy, laughing because he believed no one could ever catch him. Now the silence felt heavier than ever. One afternoon, Evelyn Carter stopped by, carrying a thick folder containing the prosecution's evidence. It's finished, she said softly. The district attorney is moving forward. I nodded without opening the folder. How strong is the case? Evelyn gave me a sympathetic look. Arthur. There isn't much left to argue about. She explained that investigators had traced Vanessa's months of unauthorized entries, recovered deleted messages from her phone, discussing trust documents and property transfers, matched fingerprints to the burglary tools, and verified every recording from the security system. More importantly, Ryan had chosen to cooperate fully. He wasn't trying to escape responsibility anymore. He had voluntarily described every conversation leading up to the break-in, every warning he ignored, and every opportunity he had to walk away. "He's not making excuses," Evelyn said quietly. "He's accepting what he did." I remained silent for a long moment before asking the question that mattered most. "And Vanessa?" Evelyn slowly closed the folder. "She still believes someone else is responsible." That answer saddened me more than I expected. Ryan had finally begun facing the truth. Vanessa was still running from it. Several days later, I received permission to read part of Ryan's official statement before the trial. I sat alone in Helen's favorite chair and unfolded the pages carefully. The first sentence nearly stopped my heart. "I never stopped loving my father. I just stopped listening to the values he spent his entire life trying to teach me." I continued reading. Ryan admitted that Vanessa never forced him to commit a crime. She had influenced him, persuaded him, and encouraged him, but every final decision had still been his. He described how each compromise seemed small at first. Looking at financial papers, asking questions about inheritance, entering my apartment when I wasn't home. Every step felt temporary. Every step seemed easier to justify than the last. By the time the safe became part of the conversation, he had already crossed so many lines that turning back felt impossible. Tears blurred the words on the page. I wasn't reading the confession of a hardened criminal. I was reading the heartbreak of a son who had finally recognized the exact moment he had lost himself. A week before the trial, Ryan asked if I would agree to a supervised meeting at the county detention center. I wasn't sure whether I was ready. For 3 days, I carried the request in my pocket without answering. Finally, I drove to the cemetery instead. Helen always had a way of helping me think clearly, even after she was gone. I stood quietly beside her grave until the afternoon breeze rustled the leaves above me. "What would you do?" I asked aloud. There was no answer, of course, only silence. Yet standing there, I remembered something Helen used to tell Ryan whenever he made mistakes as a child. "Real courage begins the moment you stop blaming everyone else." I smiled sadly. "He finally stopped blaming everyone else," I whispered. 2 days later, I walked into the detention center. Ryan looked thinner than I remembered. The confidence he once carried into every room had disappeared completely. He sat across from me behind the glass, unable to meet my eyes. Nearly a full minute passed before he finally spoke. "Dad," his voice cracked. "I don't deserve for you to be here." I picked up the phone slowly. "No," I answered honestly. "You don't." Ryan nodded. He wasn't offended. He agreed. "I've replayed that night 1,000 times, he said quietly. "Every time I reach the elevator, I wish I'd turned around." He looked down at his hands. "You know what hurts the most?" I waited. It wasn't losing my freedom. Tears filled his eyes. It was realizing I stopped seeing you as my father and started seeing you as an obstacle. Hearing those words felt like someone had reached into my chest. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Finally, I took Helen's pocket watch from my jacket and held it against the glass between us. Ryan immediately recognized it. His eyes filled with fresh tears. "Mom used to tell us," I said softly, "that time never gives us second chances. It only gives us opportunities to choose differently the next time." Ryan covered his face with both hands. "I would give everything to go back." I slowly shook my head. "You can't." He looked up again. "I know." His voice was barely a whisper now. "So all I can do is spend the rest of my life becoming someone you and Mom wouldn't be ashamed to call family again." Those words stayed with me long after I left the detention center. As I walked through the parking lot toward my truck, I realized something had changed. The man sitting behind that glass wasn't the same son who had followed Vanessa into my building with a duffel bag full of burglary tools. He was finally seeing the truth without excuses, without pride, and without anyone else to hide behind. Whether that would be enough to rebuild what had been broken, I honestly didn't know. But for the first time since Helen died, I allowed myself to believe that redemption was no longer impossible. It would simply demand far more time than betrayal had taken to destroy. The courtroom was nearly silent on the morning the verdict was read. Reporters filled the back rows, attorneys shuffled stacks of paperwork, and strangers whispered about a family they had only come to know through headlines. I sat alone on the wooden bench where Helen would have been sitting if life had been kinder to both of us. Throughout the entire trial, I kept wondering what she would have said if she could see us now. I already knew the answer. She wouldn't have celebrated anyone's downfall. She would have mourned the choices that led us there. Detective Marcus Hale testified first, calmly walking the jury through every stage of the investigation. He never exaggerated. He never dramatized. Every conclusion was supported by timestamps, surveillance footage, electronic access logs, forensic reports, and physical evidence collected from the scene. Then Evelyn Carter presented the complete timeline, showing how dozens of seemingly harmless decisions slowly became deliberate crimes. She didn't describe a single terrible night. She described months of calculated choices that eventually destroyed a family. When Ryan took the witness stand, the courtroom became completely still. He no longer looked like the confident businessman everyone had once admired. He looked like a son carrying the weight of every mistake he could no longer change. He never asked the jury for sympathy. He never blamed Vanessa. He never blamed financial pressure. He blamed only himself. "Every time I ignored my conscience," he said quietly, "I told myself it would be the last compromise. I believed one more bad decision could somehow erase the one before it. Instead, every compromise only made the next one easier." He paused, taking a slow breath before looking directly toward me. "My father spent his entire life teaching me that character is built by the decisions nobody else sees." I remembered those words every single time I chose to ignore them. Tears filled his eyes, but he continued speaking. "I thought success meant giving my family a better life. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that my parents had already given me the greatest gift anyone could receive. They taught me honesty. I traded that away because I convinced myself I could earn it back later." No one in the courtroom spoke. Even the judge remained silent for several moments before the proceedings continued. Vanessa also testified, but, unlike Ryan, she refused to accept responsibility. She insisted everything had been misunderstood, that circumstances had forced difficult decisions, and that everyone else had exaggerated her actions. Listening to her, I finally understood something Helen had once told me many years earlier. A person cannot begin changing until they first accept the truth about who they have become. Weeks later, after carefully reviewing every piece of evidence, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all major charges. Vanessa received a lengthy prison sentence for financial exploitation of an elderly adult, commercial burglary, identity theft, and conspiracy. Ryan was also convicted, but the judge acknowledged his complete cooperation, genuine remorse, and willingness to testify truthfully. His sentence reflected both accountability and the possibility of rehabilitation. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus approached me quietly. "Arthur," he said, "you spent your career bringing dishonest people to justice. Does this one feel any different?" I looked toward the empty witness stand before answering. Every other investigation ended when the verdict was read. I paused. This one doesn't. Life slowly settled into a quieter rhythm. I reopened Helen's garden behind the apartment building exactly the way she had always wanted it. The roses bloomed again the following spring, and every Saturday morning I found myself sitting on the same old wooden bench where we used to drink coffee together before the world became busy. Sometimes I brought Helen's silver pocket watch with me, winding it slowly while listening to the gentle ticking that reminded me life never truly stops moving forward. Nearly a year after the trial, I received a letter from the Federal Correctional Facility. I recognized Ryan's handwriting immediately. This time, I didn't hesitate before opening it. "Dad," it began, "I'm not writing because I expect forgiveness. I'm writing because, for the first time in my life, I'm learning the difference between regret and responsibility. Regret is wishing the past had never happened. Responsibility is choosing who you become because it did." I continued reading through tears. Ryan described spending his days working in the prison library, studying ethics, counseling younger inmates who reminded him of the man he used to be, and writing down every lesson he wished he had understood years earlier. Near the end of the letter, one paragraph stayed with me longer than any other. "Mom always said integrity is something you practice when nobody is watching. Prison has taught me that character isn't rebuilt by one apology. It's rebuilt one honest day at a time. I don't know if I'll ever deserve to be called your son again, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of the name Bennett." A month later, I drove to the correctional facility. As I waited in the visitor's room, I wasn't certain whether I had come to offer forgiveness or simply to keep a promise. Helen and I had made decades earlier that no matter how lost our son became, we would never stop hoping he could find his way home. Ryan walked into the room more slowly than I remembered. His hair had begun turning gray around the temples, and the confidence that once filled every room had been replaced by quiet humility. He sat across from me, unable to meet my eyes. Finally, he whispered, "Do you think Mom would still be disappointed in me?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "She would be heartbroken by your choices." I paused, feeling Helen's ring inside my jacket pocket. "But she never believed people should be defined forever by the worst day of their lives." Ryan lowered his head as tears rolled silently onto the table between us. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. There was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to defend. Only truth remained. Finally, I reached across the table and placed Helen's silver pocket watch into his hands. He stared at it in disbelief. "Dad," I smiled sadly, "your mother always believed this watch wasn't valuable because it measured time." He looked up at me through tears. I gently closed his fingers around it. "It was valuable because it reminded us that every new day gives us another chance to choose who we want to be." Ryan broke down completely. For the first time since he was a child, I saw him cry without shame, without excuses, and without pretending to be stronger than he felt. I reached across the table and rested my hand on his shoulder. I wasn't telling him everything was forgiven. Some wounds take years to heal, some never heal completely. But I was telling him something just as important. He had not lost the opportunity to become a better man. As I drove home that afternoon, I looked in the rearview mirror until the prison disappeared behind the hills. I finally understood something Helen had known all along. Families are rarely destroyed by one terrible decision. They fall apart through countless small compromises that seem harmless in the moment. And perhaps redemption works the same way. It isn't earned through one apology or one act of courage. It's built one honest decision at a time, every single day. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this: never allow money, pride, or fear to become more valuable than the people who stood beside you before you had any of them. Protect your character before you protect your wealth. Because fortunes can always be rebuilt, trust cannot. Thank you for spending this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today and what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you believe stories about family, betrayal, justice, redemption, and second chances still matter, don't forget to subscribe to Truth Forge Stories. Until next time, take care of the people you love, because one day they may become the only treasure that truly matters.